everyone, I'm Uriah Heep, and welcome to the Great American Novel Series brought to you by The Author's Matrix. Tonight's episode is Chapters 26, the final chapter of The Village Idiot. As you recall, Nigel came home after his career was dashed on the rocks by Dr. Higgins to a darkened house. What will he find when he enters? Let's find out.
Chapter 26. The door resisted his efforts, but Nigel persevered and entered his flat. It was true, the house was deserted and eerily calm. He checked the bedrooms but found no one asleep. He reasoned it was late morning, and his daughters were likely out with their mum as the schools were on holiday this week. As he dressed for his new life of leisure without a meaningful career ahead of him, it dawned on him that the university had supplied the flat he and his family occupied as part of his compensation. He would likely be evicted within the month and must make plans to ensure his family had a safe, warm place to live. He made his way to the kitchen, where he spied a note left for him on the table. He froze. Fiona was not one to leave notes lying around for his perusal, and he immediately feared the worst. Carefully, he took up the note and sat down to read it. He read as he unfolded the parchment and recognized his wife's handwriting. Dearest Nigel, as I pondered our lives together, I valued all the meaning that junction of our two selves meant to both of us. These past months together made for a strain in our marriage that neither of us could have foreseen or imagined. I must admit that the revelation of your obsession with water shook our very foundation. I do not understand how you could be so adamant about pursuing this course and risking all we have built together all these years, but risk it, you have. Know that I have been in communication with the university this morning and have learned of your dismissal. I fear that this will drive you ever more insane in the pursuit of your so-called truth. And, Nigel dearest, it frightens me. I no longer believe it is safe for you to be around our daughters and myself, and I fear for your sanity. Of course, Nigel dearest, I still love you with all my heart, as do your daughters, but I must take them away now, and I implore you to seek the help you need to overcome this fever that has gripped you. I have taken Iona and Morag to my mum's house in Scotland. I implore you not to pursue us, as it will be in vain. Perhaps one day you will be sane and whole again, and I will wait for that glorious day. For now, Nigel, we all pray for you and ask that God has mercy on your soul. Fiona. Nigel could not weep or scream. Instead, he was numb. As he gently placed his dear wife's note on the table, he felt nothing. As he stared off into space, his thoughts seemed to vanish from his consciousness. The view from the kitchen window was dismal. The chill of the morning had given way to a steady drizzle. The flat next door, with its fading brick facade, seemed to add to the bleakness that enveloped Nigel. Meanwhile, at the esteemed University of London, Dr. Higgins was celebrating his triumph over his nemesis. Many loyal sycophants gathered in his office to toast their hero. "It is a grand day," chortled Dr. Billingsworth as he raised his glass. "Did you see the look on that fool's face, gentlemen?" All laughed uproariously and saluted Higgins. It seemed that Dr. Billingsworth was not the fair-minded interim dean that everyone believed. He had been in cahoots with Dr. Higgins and helped his friend orchestrate the entire Machiavellian affair that led to Nigel's ouster and ruin. Among those celebrating in Dr. Higgins' office that morning was not a university colleague. He was an older gentleman, grizzled and worn, with sores spotted all over his face and hands. His yellowed, bony fingers clutched his glass of champagne and toasted with all the professors, and seemed even more pleased at the results than even Dr. Higgins. What was left of his white hair fell off in chunks as he whirled around, glad-handing every professor in the room. It was a glorious day for all. "Speech! Speech!" demanded the professors, and Dr. Higgins cheerfully obliged his adoring fans. As he began, the older gentleman among them slid backward to blend in unnoticed behind the professors and happily ceded the floor to Dr. Higgins. "Esteemed colleagues," Dr. Higgins began, I know we all tend to use the term esteemed when referring to each other, and this grand university we serve so righteously together each day. But today, that term has never been so richly deserved as it is at this very moment. Hear! Hear! Roared the gathered. It is truly a grand day for this university, he continued. We have all stood up for truth, and there is no more noble pursuit than any of us can claim as our own. Dr. Higgins raised his glass of champagne above his head, and one could see the chunks of fecal matter bobbing up and down as he spoke. The professors raised their glasses and once again chanted, "Here! Here!" to their hero, and all drank. As the professors downed their champagne, Dr. Higgins resumed his speech, much to the delight of all. I have one more individual among us that demands our attention, he began. I could not have successfully had that charlatan removed from our midst without the assistance of my new, dearest friend. It was he who sought me out and provided the damning evidence that I so desperately sought. He travelled at his own expense from Crumbly Village to London, much to his detriment as he has health challenges, to provide me with the copy of the Crumbly Village Times that sealed Crumbly's fate. The professors stirred, and each looked at the other, somewhat dumbfounded. I give you the esteemed... There I go again! And the crowd roared with laughter yet again. Yes, I will say it again. The esteemed publisher of the Crumbly Village Times, Lord Jake Holdsapfel. At first all was quiet, then rapturous applause broke out with a spontaneity that thrilled Dr. Higgins. Having shrunk from all notoriety amongst the group, Lord Jake was thrust into the spotlight, which pleased him no end. Dr. Higgins made his way to the back of the crowded office, led the Lord to the front of the gathering, and laid his hand on his bony shoulder, smiling broadly with their rotted teeth displayed before the professors. Dr. Higgins refilled their glasses and held them up high above their heads. It is the honour of my life, Dr. Higgins exaggerated, to welcome one of the most important individuals in all the land. Lord Jake Holdsapfel is the courageous one who sought me out and supplied me with the damning copy of the Crumbly Village Times that provided all the evidence we needed to seal the fate of Nigel Crumbly. You see, gentlemen, it was his father who published that article over a decade ago, after young Nigel Crumbly disgraced himself and his university at a science symposium with where he proved his fealty to one Addison Way, the originator of that ludicrous pseudo-scientific theory on the nature of water that forevermore poisoned young Crumbly's mind and ruined him. The professors stirred. They had remained entirely ignorant of Nigel's history, and this story only reinforced the urgency of the coup d'état that Dr. Higgins had just managed to execute. It was Lord Jake's father, Dr. Higgins continued, who dubbed that charlatan, Addison Way, the village idiot many decades ago when he disgraced the same university where our own Nigel Crumbly did his undergraduate work. Suppose anyone here knows the true value of history. In that case, they know that the Holdsapfel family will go down in history as one of the most important and influential families in all human history. They have stood for truth and knowledge in the face of insanity and prevailed. The cheers that went out that miserable morning filled the room. As each professor hoisted his fecal-filled champagne glass to the heights and downed it collectively, Dr. Higgins held Lord Jake's hand high above his head and shook it vigorously. The thunderous cheers lasted for minutes, and all were particularly satisfied with themselves. None more so than Nigel Crumbly's childhood friend, Lord Jake Holdsapfel, who finally fulfilled his lifelong quest to exact his revenge and ruin Nigel's life. As Nigel sat in his flat, truly alone in the world once again, he pondered his future, if there was one. He carefully folded his wife's note and placed it among the pages of a science book he had received from Addison Way many years ago. He hoped that one day he would retrieve that note in the presence of his wife, and they would have been restored. Nigel thought back to the earliest days of his friendship with Addison, when he was just a naive college student, wholly ignorant of the ways of the world. He had no idea at the time that he was meeting the most important knowledge the world has ever known, and his responsibility to honor, protect, and be completely fair to that knowledge would be the most important legacy he could leave the world. I was a fool, Nigel thought to himself. I should have taken care of that most dear to me. Addison was correct when he told me that people did not want to learn something large that did not have sufficient prestige to make themselves important. Nigel walked about his flat when the realization struck him that the university owned this flat and would be evicted now that he had been dismissed. What is this flat worth to me? Nigel asked himself. It is a mere 4 walls and a roof. It stands for nothing. At that moment, Nigel came to a determination that would alter, once again, the direction of his life. I have nothing to lose now, he thought to himself. I must go and see Addison and express my undying regret for having abandoned him. I left my mentor and friend in pursuit of the plaudits and approbation of the academic world, and what was gained? Swiftly, Nigel packed his bag and made his way to the station to take the next train to the village of his ancestors. As he glanced over his shoulder, he saw the University of London in the background, rising above the decrepit buildings surrounding its grounds. He paused momentarily and recalled the first time he had set foot on that campus. The feelings of that day long ago haunted him, and he turned around and continued his journey home. What importance did I achieve there? None. I was a fool. Late that afternoon, Nigel arrived in the village of Crumbly. He wished no one would recognize him, and thankfully, no one did. He made his way to the statue of his ancestor, Aldous Crumbly, which remained evermore and steadfastly in the centre of the village, looking a bit more worn than the last time he had viewed it. Looking up, he wondered if Aldous would have preferred his comfort to the truth, as he had, and as he did, his regret grew, along with his determination to express that regret honestly to Addison. As he made his way up the hill towards his family house, he pondered how his mum would have greeted him if she were still alive. After his father had passed away many years ago, his mum lingered for what seemed an eternity before joining her husband in the grave. Nigel believed with all his heart that had he been able to convince the two of them to rid themselves of raw sewage, they would still be alive today. It would be one of the searing regrets he knew he would one day take to his grave. He passed the house and paused momentarily to pay his respects to his parents. He thought how hard they worked to give him a good life, and how they endured much pain in their lifetimes, pain that was largely unnecessary. He set out for Addison's Highland cabin and made perfect time. As he spied the cabin in the distance, he noticed the property had fallen into disrepair. The weeds were flourishing, and nature appeared to reclaim what was once its own. The terrible thought struck him that perhaps he was too late. He quickened his pace, stepped upon the property, and looked at the cabin, now only meters from him. The roof was rotted, and the bit of paint left on the sides was worn and discoloured. He hoped he was wrong, but the property appeared to have been abandoned some time ago. As he approached the front door, he noticed a paper attached to the door and fluttering in the breeze. It was true. The property had been abandoned and was being sold by the bank. The date on the leaflet convinced Nigel that the property had not had a resident in over a year. He peered inside a window and saw a spot of furniture scattered about, but nary a sign of life. Nigel made his way around the back of the cabin to Addison's workspace. The door to his lab was ajar, and he managed to gain entry despite some resistance from the rusted bolts. The lab was like a time warp. It was precisely as Nigel remembered it years ago. It was as if Addison had worked there this morning, save the layer of dust that covered his equipment. Nigel had had some of his largest emotions in this lab, and the realization that Addison was indeed gone finally struck him, and he wept bitterly. His greatest friend and mentor was gone, and all that was left was the regret he felt that he had not been fair to the one person in the world who was so fair to him. Nigel looked down at his tear-stained hands as he withdrew them from his swollen eyes, and saw the sores that had persisted despite his valiant attempts to rid himself of all raw sewage. Slowly and painfully, he left Addison's lab and found himself walking down the pathway towards the village of Crumbly again. He noticed not the birds flying above, nor the squirrels gathering their food. He saw nothing but the bleak sky above and the glimmering lights of the village named after his ancestors as it came into view. It was at that very moment that Nigel froze and had what some people would characterize as an epiphany. It was in his greatest moment of darkness that he saw light. "This all doesn't have to be this way," Nigel said aloud, so the birds above and the squirrels below could hear him. "I will carry on Addison's life work in his lab." Nigel turned and raced back up the hill in a frenzied state unfamiliar to him. He reached Addison's lab, flung open the door, and stepped inside. As he ran around the lab, spying on the equipment lying about, he saw that everything was still there, waiting for the next experiment. There would be work to ready the lab, but everything necessary to continue Addison's work was present. Nigel and his family had lived in subsidized housing provided by the University of London for some time, so their expenses were meagre. Nigel, being of a frugal mind, had saved generously. He swiftly calculated the savings accumulated over the years and returned to town to meet with the agency selling Addison's property. The meeting went exceedingly well, and Nigel and the agent consummated the transaction without any impediments. Within just a few days of his arrival in the village of Crumbly, Nigel now owned Addison's lab and had begun work. Continuing his life's work and having it known to the world will honour his memory, and one day, everyone will know of Addison Way, Nigel proclaimed to himself as he readied the lab to purify water once again. And when humanity knows how the greatest man who ever lived, whom the world gave its finest mind, was treated by the fixed, sclerotic minds of our time, including, regretfully, myself, the world will mourn for 600 years. Epilogue. Nigel spent his days in Addison's lab working tirelessly to refine the process, begun by Addison, of purifying water with great success. A few of Addison's students heard of Nigel's continuing their teacher's work, and they all readily agreed to assist. Reintroducing fresh, pure water restored the health of all who partook in Nigel's lab. Dr. Higgins met his untimely death weeks after being awarded the Science Department chair at the University of London. He had gorged himself with fecal-laced crumpets in his office one evening while celebrating his Pyrrhic victory over Nigel, and the morning staff found him slumped over his desk, having choked to death over large chunks of fecal matter lodged in his throat. There was a lavish ceremony for the professor, despite his short tenure as chair. Many of his colleagues spoke of his unbounded courage in ousting Nigel from the university and restoring sanity where insanity had reigned. Dr. Billingsworth, who, along with Dr. Higgins, was instrumental in ousting Nigel from his post, lived a long life afterward. Unfortunately, that life was filled with both physical and cognitive decline that rendered him a mere shell of his former self. He continued to gorge himself on fecal matter as he had all his life, and it was cruelty itself that enabled him to live so long and suffer. While Nigel laboured away over the succeeding years, Lord Jake Holsapfel continued to use his power as the publisher of the Crumbly Village Times to eradicate, as best he could, any reporting on Nigel's work. He was well aware of the former chair of the Science Department's purchase of Addison Way's property, and it irked him no end. "I shall destroy any remnants of Addison Way's work," he proclaimed at one of his editorial meetings with his staff. He had grown exceedingly more morose and vindictive in his later years. He would engage in frequent screaming matches with the underlings at the paper, belittling them before audiences of his peers and denigrating their work. He developed a reputation as a ruthless ruffian and was despised by all who knew him. Those fortunate few who studied with Nigel decided that the silence of Crumbly Village Times in their ignorant boycott of Nigel's work must be countered. For years they demonstrated outside the stately building in downtown Crumbly Village that housed that paper, protesting its continued reticence on the topic of water. The protesters, including Nigel himself, demanded justice for Addison Way and his life's work, but were met with the same silence that Addison had endured all his life. It was during one rather raucous demonstration, one day in early spring, that Lord Jake Holtzapfel made his way down to the street level to confront the demonstrators directly. He had witnessed his paper being disparaged from above, as the protesters would always position themselves under the publisher's window for added effect, and his patience and thin-skinned attitude could no longer stand the insult. He paused to address the protesters as the door swung open and Lord Jake Holtzapfel stood there with bodyguards flanking him on both sides. This morning, a crowd of onlookers, curious at the regular happenings in front of the Crumbly Village Times, went silent. "It is a crime against humanity!" Lord Jake Holtzapfel bellowed with his faint, raspy voice. Fortunately, the megaphone he used to project his weakened voice filled the square outside his building. "These miscreants harass my great paper every day with their futile nonsense, and it is high time the authorities shut down this illegal protest." He paused for applause from the onlookers, but there was none, which annoyed him greatly. The demonstrators continued their orderly protest, oblivious to the rantings of Lord Jake Holtzapfel, and the onlookers could not make sense of it all. Privately, among themselves, the onlookers questioned each other about the meaning of these demonstrations. "I don't understand," one onlooker said to another. "What are they protesting? Water? It makes no sense." "It is you, sir," Nigel said to Lord Jake Holtzapfel, "that has kept from these good people behind me the life-giving knowledge that they have been desperate to hear all their lives." Lord Jake Holtzapfel was stunned as he had not recognized Nigel in the crowd. Nigel did not need a megaphone to be heard. His voice was powerful, and for a moment, Lord Jake Holtzapfel seemed stunned. Nigel had recovered from those years when he had resumed the consumption of raw sewage to assuage his wife and pander to the higher-ups in the academic world to advance his academic career. He had perfected water purification in his years working in Addison's lab, and he had regained his youthful appearance and robust health since Lord Jake Holtzapfel had seen him last. Unfortunately, his words to Lord Jake Holtzapfel that afternoon, and many afternoons after that day, fell upon deaf ears. The Crumbly Village Times continued their boycott of Addison Way's life's work, and published no honest articles about Nigel's continuing the work of Addison Way. Meanwhile, the suffering of humanity continued unabated. Every day that Nigel and his students made their way down to Crumbly Village, they witnessed the devastation around them. The good citizens, wholly ignorant of the damage they were doing to themselves and their loved ones, continued to gather around the raw sewage trenches that ran along the sides of the city streets, scooping up large chunks of raw sewage and sloping it into their buckets to prepare their morning meals. Their emaciated and bloated bodies, covered with gangrenous sores, gave evidence of the horrific effects of consuming raw sewage, yet they persisted. The emotions Nigel and his students felt as they witnessed these pathetic souls daily, knowing how different their lives could be, was almost more than their psyches could stand. Nigel's estranged wife, Fiona, remained in Scotland with their 2 daughters. Over the years, the girls would ask about their father, but Fiona remained largely reticent about his whereabouts. Over time, memories of their father faded, and they eventually stopped asking questions. The fate of their dear father remained a mystery for the rest of their short lives. Neither of them reached adulthood as disease from the consumption of raw sewage water, which was abundant in Scotland, overwhelmed their frail bodies, ending in tragedy. Fiona continued a reclusive existence for decades after the passing of her children. She continued to consume raw sewage, and her health gradually deteriorated over the years. Had Nigel ever thought to venture to Scotland to see his wife again, he would not have recognised her, so it was best that he never attempted to make that journey. A final word. Dear Unknown, friends, I implore you not to judge the good people of Crumbly Village and beyond too harshly for their ignorance. Perched high above those whose narrow-minded stupidity amazes us in its width and depth, is all too comfortable and satisfying to our egos. We are sure that none of us would have partaken in such an abhorrent practice that so obviously weakened our very lives of consuming something so despicable and detrimental to our health and well-being as raw sewage. We cannot even imagine that we would have agreed with the good people of Crumbly Village had we lived among them. Certainly not. We would have been among the few in human history with the largeness of mind and the courage to discern truth with all clarity and wisdom, reject their practices, and embrace the life-giving knowledge that Addison Way gifted to the world without hesitation. Of course, my dear readers, as I am sure you all know by now, if you have read this far, that this story never had anything to do with water. The end.
So, The Village Idiot by Dan Blanchfield. All along we thought it was about sewer water, but it wasn't. It was about how new knowledge is welcomed into the world, typically not well. So, meanwhile, I decided to make a trip to Crumbly Village and see this for myself. So, I got some sewer water, picked up some fecal matter, and now we're going to see what this fuss is all about. So, a little fecal matter. Oh, nice. Plop, plop. There you go. Is this any good? Let's find out. You know what? This isn't half bad. So, if you've listened this far, be sure to subscribe and leave some comments below the last episode here. What you thought of the book. Meanwhile, I'm enjoying some fresh sewer water with fecal matter. Not bad. So, as they say in Crumbly Village, eat shit and die. Good night.